Welcome back to Tuesday on the Damage Report. It's probably immediately clear, but my throat's all messed up, my nose all messed up. I'm kind of sick, so you can expect one of two types of shows today on the Damage Report. Either I'm going to settle into a sort of phlegmy, sensual voice for you, or I'm just gonna fall apart as we get through the show. That's probably more likely at this point, especially considering how serious the subject matter is today. We're gonna be starting off with a sort of grab bag of some of the worst things I've seen over the past couple of days in regard to the migrant detention crisis that we're experiencing right now, the treatment of especially children being held by the federal government. We've got horrible new information and a little bit of hope that we're gonna sprinkle on top of that. Through the course of the show, though, we're gonna be joined by two awesome guests. For about half the show, progressive activist Jordan Uhl is gonna be joining us to break down some of the big news of the day. We're gonna be talking about Turning Points USA, Trump's response to the new sexual assault accusation, the Trump administration trying to play tricky-pizzicky moves on how we calculate who is actually poor in America and why they're doing that, which is even worse, and lots of other stuff. We're actually gonna be closing out the show with something that's pretty scary, a poll result. What do the American people think about a preemptive nuclear strike on another country? Prepare to be horrified, actually, because this is dark stuff, but lots to get to, so we're gonna jump right into it with the migrant crisis. Virtually everything that we've learned over the past week having to do with how we as a country are treating migrants held in the concentration camps that we have along the southern border and other parts of the country has been absolutely horrendous. But some of the new reporting is actually going back quite a ways, back to 2018. Take a look at this little tidbit. In July of 2018, 37 detained migrant children boarded vans in Texas so they could be reunited with their parents at the Port Isabel Detention Center. But when they reached the Immigration and Customs Enforcement run detention facility, they had to wait and wait. It took 39 hours and 2 nights spent sleeping in vans for the last child to be processed and reunited with their family, with most of the 5 to 12-year-olds waiting at least 23 hours in the center's parking lot. So in July in Texas, they spent multiple nights sleeping in a van. On average, at least one full day in a van in July in Texas. I don't know if many of you have been in Texas in July. I lived in Austin for like 5 years. It gets hot there. And if you're a kid, you do not want to spend an hour sitting in a van in a parking lot. You know, we have news every couple times a year at least. Someone leaves their kids in a car and they die. This is how you get that. And 37 kids were stuck in those vans. And that's new, that happened. We didn't hear about it for a very long time, about a year actually at this point. And that's the sort of just casual mistreatment of these kids that ICE just does and border enforcement just does, and it's just a thing. We're gonna give you Donald Trump's response to these sorts of reporting in just a little bit, but this is to give you an idea of, we're not talking at this point about the kids who've died. That happens all the time. We're talking about just the day-to-day experience of being a kid who happens to be under the control of the federal government, how they're treated, how savagely they're treated. Now, I wanna return to the sort of big story of the last week, and that is the Trump administration arguing in court that kids in these concentration camps don't need to be able to sleep at night. They don't need soap, they don't need toothbrushes, all of that. I found that to be horrendous. Many of you felt the same way, and some people, in fact, wanted to donate these sorts of things so that the kids would have access to them. If the government's not gonna provide them, American citizens decided to step up, which is certainly good. Unfortunately, it didn't work out, because this is last Sunday, a man named Austin Savage and 5 of his friends got in an SUV, went to an El Paso Target and bought diapers, wipes, soaps, and toys. They spent $340 and then headed to a Border Patrol facility holding migrant children in nearby Clint with the goal of donating their goods. But when they arrived, they found that the lobby was closed. The few Border Patrol agents moving in and out of a parking facility ignored them. So even though the American people, a group of great people, decided to take it upon themselves and spend their money to try to make the experience of these kids a little bit more tolerable, they weren't able to actually help. Border Patrol agents just weren't interested in engaging with them. What they did find when they went to that facility, though, was that they were not the first to try to help out those kids. Let's take a look at this note that they found. Someone had left diapers and toothpaste and soap, and the note says, "I heard y'all need soap and toothpaste for kids. Maybe more will be on its way soon." And thankfully, in this case, more was on its way. The problem is, when you just leave the stuff at the facility, we have no idea if the kids actually get it. And again, while these sorts of stories, you're always gonna find things like this, they are heartwarming. It's not on individual Americans to go to Target and then bring stuff to detention facilities. That's not how this system is supposed to run. That's not sustainable. That in a number of these facilities, going across literally thousands of miles, that we can just hope that charity makes up for the vicious cruelty of the Trump administration's policy for these kids. That's not sustainable. It stands out not just in our recent experience in the US, but internationally as well. Take a look at how some people have responded to that news about the soap and the toothpaste. So if we bring up this tweet, you're gonna see one person, David Rode, who'd been held by the Taliban, said that they gave him toothpaste and soap. Michael Scott Moore, who was kidnapped by Somali pirates, say he was given toothpaste and soap. And other journalists who've been held in Iran and other facilities have said, no, they were given these things. So at this point, the bar is not just historically bad, it's not just historically low for the US. We're actually treating these kids worse than pirates treat them, okay? That should stand out, that should break through, but at this point, I'm not sure if it will. I mean, I told you yesterday on the show, I read that great quote from a Trump supporter who was like, stop trying to make us teary-eyed over these kids. I love kids, but it's on the parents not to break the law. And again, the vast majority of these people are not breaking the law. They are legally allowed under our asylum laws to apply for asylum in this country. But even if they were breaking the law, if you want any claim to being a moral person, let alone in the case of many of these people being a good Christian, the idea that our responsibility to treat kids in a humane way goes away when their parents decide to cross the border, that makes that system of morality a little bit too contingent for me and probably not worth a damn in a political sense. So the situation is actually worse. I want to return to that Clint, Texas detention facility where these good people tried to drop off some supplies. An AP report last week described conditions at that particular place where there was inadequate food, water, and sanitation for 250 infants, children, and teens. A doctor who visited the facility later filed a report saying, quote, it could be compared to torture facilities. All but 30 of those children have since been taken out of the facility and to a tent detention center. Which I guess in 2019, that's progress, that if the AP goes in and if they can get a doctor to sign off on the fact that this is effectively like a facility out of one of the Saw movies, then maybe we can move the kids. But I ask you a follow-up question, move them to where? Move them to one of the Border Patrol facilities where we really hope that they can have soap. Do we have any reason to believe that wherever they were moved is better? Or were they simply shuffled to some other army facility? Maybe with some historic connection to, I don't know, one of the concentration camps of old in Japanese internment or something like that. Do we have any reason to believe that the kids are better off? Or is this like the end of a Mario level where it's like, oh, the princess isn't here, you need to go report at another facility. And then hopefully they won't be moved again and again and again. I have an idea. How about we treat these kids like humans regardless of where they are, regardless of whether there's a doctor on hand to testify as to the condition they're being treated, regardless of whether the AP has currently tracked down that facility. How about we treat them like humans? How about we, the richest country in the history of our species, give soap and toothpaste to these kids? But I don't have a lot of hope. And the reason I don't have a lot of hope is the response from two of the people who have the most direct authority over this sort of situation, Donald and Melania Trump. Melania, she's working on that Be Best thing. So she had this announcement, this is yesterday. First Lady Melania Trump on Monday announced new Be Best ambassadors to help, and I kid you not, improve the lives of children. The ambassadors will help further the First Lady's goal of educating children and parents about the issues they face and will focus on resources and opportunities to help make a difference in the lives of children. They'll act as points of contact for pushing Be Best forward in their agencies. I have to assume that Border Patrol, ICE, probably not gonna be amongst that list of agencies because you don't really need ambassadors to know what's necessary to improve the lives of children in those agencies. I think that what you need to do is pretty much screaming in our face at this point. And I guess there's a small chance, a remote chance that this announcement by Melania Trump on her Be Best thing is just shockingly tone deaf considering what's in the news lately. But considering the attire that she's worn when going to these sorts of facilities, I don't know why we should give her that sort of benefit of the doubt. It seems like this is once again spitting on our face. You guys around the country, oh, you're really concerned about these kids? I'm gonna make a mockery of the situation by pretending that these ambassadors, often God knows where, are gonna improve the lives of kids when I know exactly what I should be advocating for and I choose not to. So that's Melania. Let's talk about Trump, asked this weekend by Chuck Todd about all of this reporting, about the torture conditions these kids are being held in these concentration camps. Here was his response.
They were built.
Let's talk about what's happening now. Your administration, you're not doing the recreation. You're not even schooling these kids anymore. You've gotten rid of all that stuff.
We're doing a fantastic job under the circumstances.
Fantastic job under the circumstances. Circumstances, again, that he can say over and over that he was saddled by this, but we've been reporting from the very beginning, this is the result of choices made by the Trump administration. Purposeful choices by him, by people like Stephen Miller, to inflict purposeful suffering on these populations to send a message. To send a message to Mexico, to Guatemala, to El Salvador, all those countries. We don't want you to come, and so we're gonna convince you that if you get over here, you're going to suffer. Some of you might die. That is the official government policy. And so Melania doesn't care, Donald Trump doesn't care. I just wanna end with something I noticed, and it struck out as any human should respond to what we're seeing here in exactly the way I'm going to show you. Not as Melania did, with at best ignorance, if not disdain for these kids, and not trying to pass the buck like Donald Trump while putting horrendous, savage policies into place. I wanna go back a year to literally the day or two before we first had, who would then later become Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who was down at the border visiting these facilities. She came back to her district, she Skyped into the show and talked about the experience. There were some photos that were taken at the time that weren't released until just yesterday. And here is one, there's others that you can see on her feed, but she's literally breaking down at what she's seeing there. And understand that she was having that 100% understandable, and I would say it should be the demanded response to what we're seeing there. This is before we knew about so much of it. We didn't know how horrendous the conditions were. We hadn't seen in a period of just a few months 6 kids dying, but she had a human response. And honestly, the opposition on the other side, they hate her for that. They're mocking her right now on Twitter for tearing up at this horrendous, horrendous stain on our history that we're writing every day. Someday, hopefully, people will be able to look back with a little bit of perspective and know how right we were to speak out against these policies, to identify them as concentration camps. But that battle is going on literally every day right now as we try to get something approaching a sane, humane policy to manage the crisis that we're seeing. Okay, we're gonna take a break. When we come back, Jordan Uhl is gonna be joining us to break down some of the big news of the day after this.
We need to talk about a relatively new show called the Republic, or UNFTR. As a Young Turks fan, you already know that the government, the media, and corporations are constantly peddling lies that serve the interests of the rich and powerful. But now there's a podcast dedicated to unraveling those lies, debunking the conventional wisdom. In each episode of the Republic, or UNFTR, the host delves into a different historical episode or topic that's generally misunderstood or purposely obfuscated by the so-called powers that be. Featuring in-depth research, razor-sharp commentary, and just the right amount of vulgarity, the UNFTR podcast takes a sledgehammer to what you thought you knew about some of the nation's most sacred historical cows. But don't just take my word for it. The New York Times described UNFTR as consistently compelling and educational, aiming to challenge conventional wisdom and upend the historical narratives that were taught in school. For as the great philosopher Yoda once put it, you must unlearn what you have learned. And that's true whether you're in Jedi training or you're uprooting and exposing all the propaganda and disinformation you've been fed over the course of your lifetime. So search for UNFTR in your podcast app today and get ready to get informed, angered, and entertained all at the same time.
Joining us now to break down the big news of the day, progressive activist Jordan Uhl. Jordan, welcome back to the show.
John, thank you for having me.
Good to have you here. How you holding up these days?
Every day's a struggle, man.
You really get into it on Twitter, as we've pointed out many times. I don't know how you keep it up, and we're gonna see if you can keep it up through a bunch of really horrendous stories in the news, so hold on to your butts. So let's start off with the big news from the past few days. Donald Trump has been accused of sexually assaulting and sexually harassing a lot of women. The most recent is Carroll, and he responded initially to her accusations with a horrendous statement accusing her of lying, like threatening some sort of vengeance against her. But recently he said this, which certainly stands out. I'll say it with great respect. Number one, she's not my type. Number two, it never happened. It never happened, okay. And that sort of response was immortalized by Chrissy Teigen as reassuring to know the president only rapes hot people. So when you hear the president says that he couldn't have raped her because she's not his type, how do you respond to that?
Well, I think first of all, like this is like what she described in her piece is quite literally what Trump is on tape bragging about in the Access Hollywood tape. It fits the bill for several other claims from other women. And also it mirrors rhetoric from Brazil's president Bolsonaro.
Yes.
Like this is just like a typical like misogynistic fascist, like just I don't know how to describe it other than he's just a pig. This is what other people have said he does. This is what he said he does. How she looks now or how he perceives her to look is irrelevant to the story. I think another point is that mainstream media largely ignored it until he said this. If you look at front pages from major newspapers like Los Angeles Times, Chicago Tribune, New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal over the weekend, none of them had this story on the front page. And now once he says this horribly offensive misogynistic thing, now everyone's interested. So I think it's important that people recognize that she should have been believed from the go. People shouldn't have ignored it until he said this, and she should be believed.
And as should be obvious and probably is obvious to the sort of people that would watch this show, but we just have to reinforce this because I think there's a reason that Trump and Bolsonaro talk about rape the way they do. Rape is not about sex, it's not about having sex with someone or being turned on. It is a violent power dynamic. That is what is being exercised. So it matters not at all whether he thought that she was attractive. And it's just like number two, it never happened. How is that not number one? How is it not number one that you're claiming that it didn't happen? Anyway, right. Like you mentioned the lack of the media coverage, and I guess from your point of view, I mean, you've watched the way the media covered the previous ones. You remember Roy Moore and his candidacy and how easily the right wing just didn't believe any of it. For at least 40 to 50% of the country, do these sorts of claims, do they matter at all? Does it matter at all that these women claim that these things happened?
I mean, that's a tough question. I would want to think that people care and people believe them, but as we've seen time and time again, the media just floats this kind of this idea that maybe it didn't. There's a little bit of uncertainty here, and I don't know. We just don't take it seriously, and this is how these problems continue to happen. This is how Trump continues to get away with it, and how no one really seems to hold his feet to the fire over it. So it's really on us to demand better and ask for people to treat these issues the way they are, the serious personal matters, and whether someone's looks does not come into play.
Yeah. The last thing I want to say about this is, I was somewhat surprised when she came out with her account because I would have expected that a couple of years in we would have known about all of these sorts of things. Although I should reiterate that how long it takes a person to report a rape has nothing whatsoever to do with whether or not it happened. But she had said that one of the reasons she didn't talk about it earlier was because she didn't think that it would matter. She didn't want to get dragged through the mud. She didn't want to get death threats, and all of that came true. And so it seems like if there are other women out there that have had experiences, I can't imagine why they would come forward at this point, knowing that best case scenario, a few people would be willing to listen, but it would have no effect whatsoever on Donald Trump or his political future, which is depressing. I apologize, but that seems like the case.
Right. This is the environment that the media has created by airing the comments from Trump and giving them publicity, more publicity than her original story. Yeah. You create this environment where women who come forward are then subject to attacks, are then evaluated based on their looks and other types of misogynistic analysis. This is what they've done, and this is the bed they've made, so they have to sleep in it.
So there's another story that I want to get your opinion on. So you're engaged in this long-running internet war against grifters, mostly on the right, but not just on the right. There's grift all across the spectrum. And this week, media outlet Sludge reported that the right-wing student organization Turning Point USA received a $50,000 donation back in 2017 from the GEO Group. This is the nation's largest private prison company. That company receives hundreds of millions of dollars in ICE contracts literally every year. That rose sharply once Trump became president. Interestingly, the next year, Candace Owens, who was at that point Turning Point's communications director, toured an ICE facility owned and operated by that company and said all these claims about how horrible it is are big lies. It's delightful here. There's paint on the walls. She literally said there's a lot of colors in places, and it's better than schools that she's gone to, even though at that point we knew that there had been hundreds of claims of sexual assault against ICE agents. What do you make of this? Do you think that those two things might be related, the donation and the coverage?
Of course. And this is just like another instance of Turning Point and their role in this kind of dark money network on the right. And if you look at just kind of how the money flows, it goes into Turning Point. Turning Point then gives them flattering reviews, completely lies about the treatment of children in their custody, and then they continue to receive these precious federal contracts. It's all absolutely connected, and this is a great story by Sludge. Alex Koch at Sludge has done a fantastic job tracking money on the right. I can't praise them enough. But yeah, this is just this is another instance of Turning Point's like seedy, dark role in this influence network on the right.
So you really have the combination of a couple of different things here. You have this organization being set up as a fake, like oh, it's students, it's young people. It's totally different than the Republican establishment, the older groups, even though they're getting their funding from the same place. Every person affiliated with this is thinking about their long-term career within that GOP establishment. And then you also have the individual grifters. You have the Charlie Kirk, you have the Candace Owens. How do we fight this battle? How do we get people to take seriously that there are people, maybe people that they trust and think are playing it straight to them, that are literally and identifiably in it for the money? What is our anti-grift strategy?
So I think we could take a more speech approach, right? So if instead of just trying to fight fire with fire, because I mean they're going to have more money in the long run because they're backed by corporations. But I think we can be smarter and we can be more effective with what limited resources we have. So I think engaging in true populist movements, working on issues that really affect the general populace, things like that will actually start a grassroots movement, and then you'll have like critical mass and be able to overpower them. But one thing, one component in that I think a lot of people don't realize is because we have this unlimited amount of money in politics, and so much of it is on the right. Like there is a moral obligation on the left for people to chip in whatever they can. It doesn't have to be a lot, but whether it's $1, $3, $5, whatever. I mean, putting a little bit of money towards these causes can really go a long way. Because when we band together, I mean, $1 from 10 million people is certainly more than the private prison has donated a Turning Point. So if we band together and we form our own true grassroots movement, we'd be able to overpower them.
You're 100% right, and actually related to that, and going back to something we talked about earlier in the show, I just want to briefly mention to the audience that I know that Act Blue has, I think that if you Google Act Blue Kids at the Border, they have a page that lets you donate money, and then it's distributed amongst a number, like I think 10 or 12 different organizations that are all working in that area. So as Jordan points out, your speech is important, but your money is important as well. Jordan, we're gonna take just a short break. If you can stick around, I have a couple more topics I want to talk to you about after this. Is that okay?
Of course.
Okay, then we'll see everybody on the other side. And now more with progressive activist Jordan Uhl. Let's talk now about poverty. The Trump administration, it's been reported this week, wants to mess with how inflation is calculated to modify where the line is for qualifying as being below the federal definition of the poverty line. And the effect of that, we're not gonna get into the math necessarily, but the effect is that literally millions of Americans could be kicked off of programs that are dependent on that line, including access to healthcare services, food assistance programs, and more. Jordan, I was just curious about your response about the way that they're gonna use math to negatively impact the lives of millions of Americans.
So I mean, this has been a long-term Republican proposal, right? So the shift is they want to move from the standard consumer price index, which is a measure of like 80,000 goods and the prices of them, to this chained CPI, which relies on a few, which many people on the left say are faulty assumptions, that people will choose different products that are lower in cost, and that's how they measure inflation. The chain CPI, which the Republicans want to move to, increases at a slower rate, which using that to describe or measure poverty would then, like as you say, kick millions of people off of social welfare programs. What this doesn't take into account is the disastrous effects of capitalism over the past century, how people have been subject to food deserts, lower wages, stagnant wages, working multiple jobs, burdened with debt, all of these other things that aren't included in this analysis. So by reducing this inflation rate and kicking people off these projects, you're only going to make it harder. And this is tantamount to Trump and his administration sweeping these issues under the rug. They don't want, it's an eyesore for him and the country. They don't want to deal with it. So they just turn a blind eye to it and just pretend they don't exist.
And what's amazing to me about this is right now we're having this national conversation about how horribly these undocumented migrant children are being treated. And I think it's very easy for especially a lot of conservative Americans to think, well, they're not us, they're not citizens, this doesn't affect me. But when we're talking about these sorts of programs, I think that they have been trained in conservative America for decades to believe that these are all probably, they're thinking racial minorities that are being affected by this, probably just Democrats, but we know by the numbers that isn't true, that when you kick these millions of people off, a lot of them are going to be big Trump fans. There's gonna be a lot of people who suddenly don't have the food stamps they need to survive on, who are wearing MAGA caps. And so it seems weird that they would probably cheer or at worst probably turn a blind eye to programs that are once again going to be negatively impacting them in an economic sense.
Yeah, it's a strange calculus. It's not one that I think that's not the conclusion if I was on their side that I would reach. But I think it's just a general disdain for people who are struggling. They fail to recognize the privilege that have got them there. I mean, Trump seems to have convinced himself that he's completely self-made despite receiving a massive multi-million-dollar loan from his dad. All of these people who are in these key decision-making positions are completely insulated from the consequences of these decisions. They're far removed from the problem itself. They don't know anyone or really seem to care about anyone in these positions. So what's it to them, right? Yeah. So we need to speak up. We need to push back against this. This can't continue because this is just going to result in more suffering. And for every 1% or so, the unemployment rate goes up. Tens of thousands of people die. A similar analysis could be used to how many people who lose access to Medicaid, how many people lose access to supplemental nutrition assistance programs. This is going to result in suffering and death.
And the consequences are very real, and unfortunately, they're somewhat hidden by the fact that we're just changing how we calculate poverty, that's all. One more topic I wanted to get your response to. We care a lot about what the media is talking about and what they're not talking about. And it turns out when it comes to the Democratic primary, there's pretty much one thing that they're talking about, and it's Joe Biden. Ken Klippenstein of TYT Investigates has some new information from a survey of media coverage of candidates from Smart News. If we could bring up this chart, you're gonna see broken down month by month the coverage in terms of number of articles of different candidates, and you can see that starting in April, that orange bar, which is, it's not Trump, you might think that, it's Biden, suddenly was getting 2.5 times the coverage of the next highest candidate, which in the past 2 months has been Elizabeth Warren. He's been getting between 3 and 4 times the coverage of Bernie Sanders. And I personally just wonder what exactly he has done to merit this much coverage, considering the huge policy plans that have been put out, especially by Warren, but also by Sanders. So what do you think about the fact that the media has been really focused on Joe Biden over the past few months?
This is another example of the corporate media pulling the strings to get their desired candidate. He poses the least or the smallest threat to them and their financial security and their profitability. I think if they see a Warren or a Sanders surging, and you have those candidates talking about breaking up big corporations, taxing the rich, that affects their bottom line. So why would they give that any more airtime than they need to? So this is just another example of that. And to the Sanders campaign's credit, they recognized this a long time ago. They knew they weren't going to get a fair shake against Clinton, so they started to build out their own media apparatus. They hired Armand Avram from Now This News. He's started a video shop in the Sanders office, and they've been cranking out, as I'm sure every viewer of TYT has seen, the viral videos from the Sanders campaign in the Sanders office, and they've been just bypassing the corporate media and speaking directly to their supporters via social media, via video. And I think all campaigns need to recognize that you can't rely on traditional and legacy media infrastructures to reach these sorts of people. You have to do it yourself. You have to be authentic, and you have to create your own content and push it out on your own. You can't rely on the MSNBCs, the CNNs, and the legacy papers to talk about you for yourself. I mean, they're just not going to if you pose a threat to their profitability.
Yeah, and of course, that's not including independent online sources necessarily, especially in video. They're talking about articles there, but that side's still struggling to get the same sorts of views. Unfortunately, that's the war that we're engaged in. Just one more thing I want your opinion on. With Joe Biden, there have been a number of different gaffes or things coming up from years past that he'd said that seemed like they would hurt him in this current primary. So some of this coverage might be negative. We know with Donald Trump, there was a lot of coverage of him. A lot of it was negative, but it didn't seem to matter as long as they were talking about him. Does Joe Biden on the Democratic side, will he suffer if there's a ton of focus on him, but it tends towards covering his gaffes and positions that seem out of step with the Democratic primary electorate?
I'd like to think that it affects him, but people generally just don't seem to care, especially older generations will just write it off or dismiss it because they've got it ingrained that because he was affiliated with the Obama administration, he's okay and he's a good guy. I don't see it that way. I assumed that his gaffes would affect him more. I guess we'll see once we hit Iowa and New Hampshire, because you never know. But the media will have you believe that he's doing fine. He's number one, and his position is concrete. So we'll see. But I'm surprised.
Yeah, hopefully we can have you back on in the near future to talk about the effect of the debates. I have a feeling there will be a lot of people who will be writing their Joe Biden wins the debate headlines before the debates actually happen, but we'll see about that. Jordan Uhl, as always, thank you for joining us. Everybody watching, you probably already follow him on Twitter, but if not, he's at Jordan Uhl, and you should definitely follow him. A lot of great information every day. So thank you again.
Thank you, John.
We're gonna take a short break here. When we come back, more for you after this. Depending on where you live in the country, you might be protected from your employer checking you and your blood stream for evidence of marijuana consumption, or they might have every legal right to do that. And if you are a frequent consumer of marijuana, that's pretty important for your economic future. Well, at least in one state, in Massachusetts, a new bill aims to bar most employers from testing for marijuana. And we're joined now by Shanel, Lindsay, founder and president of Ardent, a biotech and medical cannabis device company, to break down the implications. How's it going, Shanel?
Hello. Hey, John. How's it going? Thanks for having me.
Glad to have you on. And so when we're talking about this sort of bill, how important is this for people living in Massachusetts? How significant for their future at these companies?
Well, it's like you said, it's their entire future. And now that cannabis has been legalized in Massachusetts and across the country, this issue is becoming more and more prevalent. People have the legal right to use cannabis, but the workplace environment hasn't really caught up. And a lot of people are still subject to initial drug screenings randomly at work, and it's impacting people even more than, let's say, that their ability to drink alcohol. Because cannabis does stay in your system for so long, what's happening is people who are using on their own time at home when they're off of work are getting positive drug tests, and it's impacting their entire jobs and careers.
Yeah, and that's a great example of how I know that we like when we talk about marijuana legalization, we compare it to alcohol and how free you are to consume as much as you want. But applying the laws directly from one to the other doesn't necessarily make sense because they are different substances. So I just want to confirm a couple of different things. So in general, is it more common in places where marijuana has been legalized? Is it more common that you are protected from these sorts of screenings, or is it still like common that companies can do that?
Can I tell you that there is only one state now that has actually protected patients, and that was Nevada just a couple of days ago. They passed the first statewide protection saying that people cannot be fired for positive drug tests for having cannabis in their system. And so that is the first. So believe it or not, there aren't a ton of protections, even here in Massachusetts. We just had our first ruling last year that medical marijuana patients are protected from discrimination. the court didn't exactly rule what that meant, but there was a woman who was hired. She was found to be a medical patient after that and was fired. And the court found that you can't discriminate based on somebody being a medical patient. But there were no protections just for regular people who were using cannabis after legalization. And you find that in most states, there still is this disconnect between what's legally allowed and what people can do in the workplace. And many people don't know that, and they end up getting really serious consequences and losing their entire ability to, earn income and support their families. And so it's a huge, huge issue, which is made even more difficult by the science of cannabis, which is different than alcohol or even any other drug that you could think of, like cocaine. People can use these, harder drugs, and it gets out of their system much, much faster than cannabis, which leads to just a really interesting and hard situation.
So as people are pushing for changes in the law in this area and probably in related issues as well, I wonder how much of the issue is that when I hear people talk about marijuana legalization, especially on like Fox News, it sounds like their talking points are coming from the 1950s. Like these sound like people who have no idea what marijuana actually is, what it does and what it doesn't do. Do you have to combat a lot of misinformation about how debilitating smoking weed actually is?
Absolutely. And it's funny because you would think here in Massachusetts, because we legalized somehow that we are over that, but it's not the case at all. In fact, just a month ago, a whole group of doctors and purported experts came forward against our legalization program. And so even now what we're trying to do is roll out delivery licenses and social consumption licenses. So that's like cannabis cafes and safe places that people can go to consume cannabis, because it's still illegal to smoke in the street and in public. And so there's a huge backlash, even in legal states like Massachusetts, when it comes to having safe places for people to consume, because it's the reefer madness, it's the hysteria of people are going to be driving around using cannabis. What people don't realize is when you don't have safe places to consume, people are smoking in their car and they're driving around. And so there's absolutely still a hysteria that exists around cannabis consumption generally. And I think it's going to be really hard to get over that, because it is so deep-seated here in the fabric of America, right? In our criminal justice system. It's been tied into race, which we know is, always a huge thing to overcome. And so I think that we're going to continue to see this as legalization pushes forward. And I'm really hoping that the science can catch up at this time, because if we could get a test that could actually show impairment that doesn't exist now, I think that would go a long way to resolving this issue.
And hopefully while we're waiting for that test to develop, people will start to get a little bit more accurate information about what consumption of marijuana actually does to the body and what it doesn't do. One last question for you. So when I think about states, for instance, that have legalized marijuana on the individual level, and in terms of like ability to get dispensary licenses, have we found evidence that, as in many other areas of changes in laws, that marginalized communities are being left behind, or that the law is being adjudicated in a way that is not necessarily equitable?
Absolutely, you hit the nail on the head, and that's something that we, and me personally, are very, very dedicated to, this concept of equity in cannabis. And there was a thought back when legalization first went through Colorado that just legalizing on its own was going to be enough to lead to equity, and that was a very naive thought. Because in addition to cannabis being something that people enjoy, it's also, there's a huge industry behind it, right? And anytime you get money involved, you're gonna, corruption's gonna follow. And so very, very quickly, big money interests came in, these huge multi-state operators that do not care about the community or equity. And so in Massachusetts, we actually have the first comprehensive statewide equity program when it comes to cannabis. So specific license types that in the law have been reserved for economic empowerment applicants. And so it's great in the law, but now we're actually trying to implement it. And you wouldn't believe how difficult it is to even get a very small slice of this industry for the very populations that have been harmed by it for generations, that actually have led to it being a valuable commodity, right? I mean, other than cannabis being illegal and regulated, it would be the same as any other, agricultural product. It wouldn't be expensive. And so let's understand and know that the value of this industry was built on the backs of Black and brown people, the very same people who are being pushed out, marginalized, and still incarcerated over this. And so it's a huge issue, especially on the federal level. And I'm hoping that the people who are pushing forward things like the States Act are really taking a look and saying, where is the equity in this? Because it cannot be sliced up after. We need to get our piece of the pie now. And unfortunately, John, that is not happening.
Well, Shanel Lindsay, founder and president of Ardent, we appreciate you joining the show and breaking down these issues for us.
Thank you.
We're gonna take one last break here. When we come back, poll about possible nuclear war. What do the American people think? Prepare to be terrified. The prospect of a war with North Korea, especially any kind of nuclear war with North Korea, should be one of the most terrifying things imaginable for the American people. But a new survey shows that it's really not. And that itself should be terrifying for us. I'm talking about a new study by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist, who work with YouGov to ask Americans about a variety of different potential strikes against North Korea. And here is what they found. Among the most disturbing results discovered was that a large hawkish minority lurks within the US public. Over a third of respondents approve of a US preventative strike, as they call it, across all scenarios described, and appear insensitive to informational cues that most security experts would expect to reduce such levels of support. So what does that mean? What that means is they ask people if they would support some kind of war with North Korea, and then they find out that a certain percentage say yes. So then they make the cost of that war more onerous to try to lower support, to see if this is effective in lowering support for these sorts of wars. They find that in this case, there's a lot of Americans that don't really care what ends up happening. So let's talk about some specifics. Across all conditions, approval for a US preemptive strike on North Korea is notably, although not always significantly in a statistical sense, higher than preference, which means that while they might not prefer to do this sort of thing, if Trump were to strike North Korea, a significant percentage, maybe a majority of the US population would support it. So including, by the way, 33% preferring a nuclear strike against North Korea rather than some sort of conventional one. We're talking about a significant chunk of the American people saying if Donald Trump drops nuclear bombs on North Korea, I mean, 1/3 are like, yeah, that's exactly what I want, and more are like, well, I'm not gonna go against the president on this. Like, let that sink in. Preemptive nuclear war, like half the country might be okay under certain situations. And by the way, in terms of how damaging that would be, the negative results, which should be obvious when it comes to a nuclear strike, it didn't really change when they're prompting people. They say 15,000 civilians might die or more than 1 million civilians might die. That had virtually no impact on the American people's willingness to engage in a preemptive nuclear strike. Think about that. We're not just now talking about some neocons in government. We're talking about defense contractors or even a number of politicians in both parties who seem all too willing to engage in reckless war that has the obvious consequence of killing civilians. We have the American people being told over 1 million civilians would die, and generally a lot of them seem okay with that. And interestingly, they found that when you ask people also if they support the death penalty, you'll be shocked to find out that the people who support the death penalty are much more likely to approve of some sort of nuclear strike, even if it kills millions of civilians. When they talk to individuals in this study and ask them why they support this sort of action, many of them said things like, that's the fastest way to end North Korea, or in some cases, to end North Koreans. And so the propaganda that has made people think that North Korea is just the dictatorship, that's all it is. These people are all the same. They're not regular people like you and I. They don't need to be protected under our foreign policy. That has sunk in for a significant chunk of the American population. It's not 5%, it's not 10, it's not 20%. You are surrounded by people that if we were to start dropping nuclear bombs, many of them would be perfectly fine with that. That should be horrifying, that should be front page news. But outside of this video and an awesome write-up in Newsweek about it, I don't know how many people are actually gonna talk about this, and that's pretty scary by itself. Okay, unfortunately, I wish that we had more time because there's a lot of stuff that I wanted to get to. We were unable to connect with Shivala Madlina, the investigative reporter who's going to update us on the current succession crisis, basically, in the UK. I expect that she will be on tomorrow. So we're going to be delving into Boris Johnson, if he is going to actually take power in the UK. He's also, by the way, suffering from a new allegation of domestic abuse. We're going to be breaking that down as well. Is that actually going to harm his chances of gaining more power in the UK? She'll be joining us. We're going to have a lot more, including JR. It's going to be a normal JR Wednesday, and then a lot more. This is debate week after all, so you can expect that a little bit later on in the week, we're going to be breaking down the results of that, how it's likely to affect the polling. Is it going to enhance Biden's standing? Are Bernie or Warren going to raise? We're going to be breaking that down later on. We'll see you then. Thanks for listening to the full episode of The Damage Report. Support our work, listen ad-free, access members-only bonus content, and more by subscribing to Apple Podcasts at apple.co/TYT. I'm your host, John Adarola. I'll see you soon.